Tapped Out, the history and battle over water in the San Joaquin Valley, took you on a journey to the origins of water issues in Central California. From how the state's two main water projects were built, to the rise of the environmental movement, and the current struggle San Joaquin Valley agriculture faces in a time of extreme drought, mounting government regulations, and the continued fight of control over water in California. Now, in part 4 of Tapped Out, the discussion continues. Valley PBS has partnered with ABC30 Action News to explore the issues deeper. Warren Armstrong moderates an expert panel as the debate over water, agriculture, and protecting the environment continues to heat up. From the Clovis Veterans Memorial District Auditorium, this is Tapped Out, a conversation.
Production funding for this program has been provided by the Myers Farms Family Trust, bringing awareness to the consumer of the responsible agricultural practices performed by farmers in the fertile fields of the San Joaquin Valley, preserving the world's food supply and natural habitats for the generations yet to come. We are proud to support quality educational programs like Tapped Out and Valley's Gold, only available on Valley PBS.
Hello and welcome to the Clovis Veterans Memorial District Auditorium. I'm Warren Armstrong from ABC30 Action News. ABC30 is proud to partner with Valley PBS for the 4th part of a landmark docu-series they produce called Tapped Out, the history and battle over water in the San Joaquin Valley. The 3-part film took on the enormous task of explaining water history in California and the challenges agriculture faces today with severe drought, increasing environmental regulations, and a lack of new water storage infrastructure. Tonight, we're going to continue the conversation this film inspired with some of the actual people you've seen in the series. We'll try to better understand the issues we all face as Californians in a place where water is so critically important to urban users, agriculture, and the environment. We have a lot of ground to cover, a lot of issues to talk about tonight, so let's meet our panelists. We'll start with Jeff Aiello. Jeff is a veteran television producer with more than 30 years' experience in broadcast networks and cable channels across the country. In 2014, Jeff and his wife Jill started their own production company, 1830 Entertainment, and landed their first major cable deal in 2015, producing the documentary Billy the Kid, The New Evidence for the National Geographic Channel. Jeff is also the creative force behind Tapped Out. Our next panelist is Aubrey Betancourt. As Executive Director of the California Water Alliance, Aubrey Betancourt directs the statewide water policy nonprofit that advocates for the water needs of California families, cities, businesses, farmers, and the environment. Our next panelist is Sarge Green, a waste management specialist at the California Water Institute and Center for Irrigation Technology at California State University, Fresno. Currently, he is involved in rural water issues and groundwater management on behalf of the California Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley and the university. Next, we have Mario Santoyo, the Executive Director for the newly formed San Joaquin Valley Water Infrastructure Authority, representing 5 counties. Mario is also the Executive Director for the California Latino Water Coalition and the Vice President for the Clean Water and Jobs for California Coalition. Our next panelist, Sharon J. Weaver. Sharon is the Executive Director of the San Joaquin River Parkway and Conservation Trust. She has a degree in political science from the University of California, Davis. Sharon joined the trust in 1999 and became Deputy Director of the trust in 2008. And our 6th and final panelist is Stuart Wolf. Stuart Patrick Wolf is President and CEO of Wolf Farming and Processing, a family-owned operation whose primary business is the production and processing of agricultural commodities. He has served as Chairman of the California League of Food Processors and the Almond Board of California. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, we have a lot to do this evening, a lot to talk about. Let's get started with Jeff Aiello, again, the creative force behind this documentary. Jeff, I'll put this first question to you. You grew up in Clovis. Your backyard was the Sierra. But yet now you have produced this documentary. What was your motivation for producing this documentary on this very complicated issue of water, which you've heard about all your life? Why do it now?
Well, when PBS asked me to produce this or take a look at the project, I was excited to do it because, like a lot of Californians that pay attention to the news and pay attention to what we hear in the local media, you think you know what's going on with water, but you really can't grasp it. And I always wanted to have a better understanding of it, and there's no better way than to dive headfirst into a giant project like this. What made this project rewarding for me was that we had 3 hours to tell a story instead of a half an hour or 1 hour, which really wouldn't have been enough time to give to a topic like this. So we were able to really be patient with it. I knew that the topic of once you dive into this topic, it's very complicated and very complex. And I knew that I wanted to, as a storyteller, break it down into the key components from a historic standpoint. I wanted the viewer to understand the history of the San Joaquin Valley, the 2 major water projects, and then kind of the environmental revolution of the 70s and where we are now with all of that. And so I was able to do that broken over those 3 hours, and it's been an awesome experience, I have to tell you.
Jeff, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself here, but this question to you, after doing all these 3 hours, this documentary, what is the main thing that you've come across or that you've taken out of doing this special?
That I think it's possible to find some common ground with some of the major issues if we can figure out a common goal, if we can figure out the common goal. I know we're going to talk about this with the panel today. But for me, when I tried to boil this whole thing down to its lowest common denominator, what I kept going to was, do we want to be a country that grows its own food source? Because you can fight about everything else, but at the end of the day, everything's going to boil down to one or 2 points when you get through all the other stuff, right? Of course, there's money involved and there's power involved and all the stuff that's associated with any complex issue. But at the end of the day, if we keep going the way we're going, and what I mean by that is, in my takeaway is environmental regulations that are, I think, overdone, and squeezing the agricultural industry too hard, there's going to be a cost that's going to cost us at some point.
Well, Jeff, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, a lot to discuss tonight. So let's get right to that. And I'll direct this first question to Aubrey Betancourt. Aubrey, one of the takeaways, I think, or one of the key phrases in Jeff's documentary is the phrase, the value of water storage. It's a simplified question, but what do you think is the best solution for water storage in the Central Valley?
Build it.
Build it.
Build
it is what?
Build water storage. So California actually designed its entire water system of reservoirs and dams and aqueducts and channels, and it hasn't had any major upgrades since arguably the 60s and 70s. And at the time, the system was only designed for 2 types of water use, agricultural and municipal and industrial. But as Jeff alluded to, there was a massive social revolution and a consciousness raised about the environmental impacts and resource use on environmental impacts. And so we introduced a 3rd water user to a system that was never designed for it. And it has been limping along all the way until today, now having to give 50% of that water supply, that developed water supply, to these environmental programs, and causing a fight between the other users. And there's a lot of more we could discuss, I'm sure we will, on the regulatory side and on these policies and these programs that the water's going to. But the reality of it is, if the argument is we need more water for various uses, including a growing population, a changing relationship to the resource, our system is undersized for the modern priorities it is trying to serve. And so as simple as saying build it, what is the solution for water storage in the Central Valley? Part of it is investing in new infrastructure in certain locations, such as Temperance Flat, which Mario's really the true expert there, but also the flexibility that creates. When we talk about building new water storage in California, we aren't talking about doing it the way it was done 100 years ago and damming up new rivers and all of that. As simple as using existing reservoirs and expanding some of their capacity, as well as being strategic about where we can sink groundwater and look for underground storage, as well as looking for ways we can get off of that main artery through coastal desal and water recycling, and utilizing all these technologies, we can create flexibility in our system where you wouldn't actually have to necessarily have to expand and dam up every river in California. You create the operational flexibility using the existing system with some new upgrades using new technology.
Aubrey, thank you very much. Mario, since she kind of tapped you there, we're going to move on to you and talk about some of the elements that she also brought up. And let's talk about the Temperance Flat Dam. That's the dam that's proposed for the upper San Joaquin River, above Friant Dam, above Millerton Lake. What is the current situation, the current status of trying to build that dam at this time?
Well, we're actually in a very fortunate position today as compared to prior years, and that is that we have the opportunity to apply for a large set of funds through the state of California under Proposition 1. They have what they call a water storage investment program. And so we have an application that will be submitted by August of this year, in which we're hoping to secure as close to $1 billion as possible. Not that that would build the dam itself, because the dam costs approximately $3 billion, but we figure that $1 billion from the state will get us a long way going to DC and getting the feds to put some money on the table. Then whatever is left, then we go to the stakeholders and produce that last set of funds. So in other words, it's a three-legged stool that we're at least focused on.
How much arm twisting do you think you'll have to do to secure that final $1 billion, and how many hurdles do you think you will have to jump over with environmental concerns?
Well, I don't think it's going to be too difficult to get the direct beneficiaries to fund the project, because they've gone through 5 years of drought and a couple of years of zero allocation. They fully understand the value of water and what it means not to have it. To address your second question, I fully expect a huge pushback from the environmental community, as they would normally do on any major project like this one. But you know, the battle is what it is.
Let's hear from Sharon Weaver then, the Executive Director of the San Joaquin River Parkway and Conservation Trust. This would greatly impact what you want to do on the parkway, I suppose. Now, what environmental concerns do you have about seeing Temperance Flat get built?
Well, our organization is actually focused on land conservation on the San Joaquin River. We haven't taken a formal position on Temperance Flat Dam, and I think some of the concerns that I've heard about Temperance Flat are things like, you know, in a lot of years we don't actually get enough water runoff to fill it up for it to be a useful storage solution. So it's not something that we've spent a lot of time on. Our focus is really on creating a thriving environment on the San Joaquin River between Friant Dam and Highway 99, and preserving the land along the San Joaquin River for all of the valley's people.
Sarge Green, let me turn to you then from Fresno State. In years like this, though, would this Temperance Flat would just be a water bank, so to speak, wouldn't it? You'd be able to store all that excess water that we've had coming down out of the Sierra.
Well, we'd have a tremendous opportunity to capture more. There are some years, however, where you really even exceed something the capacity of both Temperance as enlarged Friant. So yeah, it'd be a tremendous boon to the ability to capture a lot of the runoff, and one of the most important benefits would be have the opportunity to sink it into the ground and use it as a source for groundwater replenishment. I think that's one of the biggest benefits thus far that we've potentially outlined. But Temperance Flat wouldn't be the solution for everything. It's still, there's a tremendous shortage for both water supply for irrigation, but then also for the community. So I think Temperance Flat is a part of a larger puzzle that needs to be worked on.
Part of that puzzle, and I will go back to Mario, and that's regarding, again, the cost. You brought up the $3 billion cost. And part of the environmental concern that I have heard is that Temperance Flat is too costly to build, that no one will want that water because that water is going to cost too much per acre foot to come out of there. Is that a true statement in your thinking?
I don't think so. I don't think that they've done accurate accounting in terms of the way the cost would be allocated to the existing contracts. But I want to first touch on what was said earlier regarding the years in which there isn't a lot of water to fill Temperance Flat. You know, let me clarify, is this year alone, after a 5-year drought, 5 years worth of drought, we now have a situation where we're releasing flood releases to the ocean, and to date we've exceeded 1.3 million acre feet alone, this year alone. That represents more than a year's worth of water for the farmers and the cities on the east side of the valley. Now, this doesn't happen just once in a while. Over the past 30 years, we have released over 15 million acre feet to the ocean. Think about that. So the idea that somehow we never get enough water to fill the reservoir is just not an accurate perspective. Now think about what Sarge said. You know, if we're going to basically recharge our groundwater, you have to be able to remanage that water that otherwise goes to the ocean. The fact is that both the Friant Division and the San Luis unit was built specifically because of groundwater overdrafting. That was the solution to stop that problem, which created subsidence. That is the opportunity we have today, is to capture that millions of acre feet and start recharging our groundwater. Because as you know, we are now facing a new law in California, and that's the groundwater sustainability law, which in essence means is that you cannot use your groundwater unless you can prove that you're recharging the same amount of water back into your groundwater. You're not going to be able to do it if you can't manage that flood water that's currently going out.
Warren, if I could just real quick, sure. In filming this documentary, I spoke with a lot of environmentalists, people that are on that side of this thing, and that I always thought to me was the weakest argument against the dam, and I heard it a lot, and you saw it in the documentary. Was that, well, it's years like this don't come all the time, so we don't want to build that. It doesn't make sense to build it. But it's like an oxymoron. It's like that we need the storage. It just seems so intuitive that we've what's the new population numbers that just came out for California?
30.
I think we're in the 50s now.
We're
at 50.
We're definitely above 40.
No, 55 million, I think. Didn't we just see that?
It's gained, not by me that much, but it's around 50 million perhaps.
Right. Anyway, we haven't built the dams, and so the pushback to not building the dam, the arguments I've heard to not do it on a river that already has 3 or 4 dams on it, by the way, they just don't seem to hold water.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about why that might be. I think part of the problem over the long term, and I've been in the water business a long time, it's not always necessarily about the project. It's about whose hand is on the handle, who's operating it, and for what purposes. So if you can find a way to pull together a water team where we get everybody together, you have an opportunity to figure out who's going to run it and when and how, so that you can meet multiple objectives. I think we all would agree there's a lot of good value in having environmental goals, but we don't meet them very often right now. We just fight over them. And so if we had a team approach where if we had certain goals and we wanted to meet them and we all agreed and then figured out how to get that done, I think a lot of the arguments about some of the infrastructure improvements would go away.
Let's bring the president and CEO of Wolf Farming and Processing, Stuart Wolf, into this discussion. Stuart, you have some thoughts on Temperance Flat, I know, and I'd also like to know what you think about flood control and how important that is, Temperance Flat and Friant Dam, to your property where you farm on the west side.
So we have property out in western Fresno County that really isn't necessarily challenged with flooding in that area, but we also have properties along the San Joaquin River in Madera. So first, the west side, I would just say, as any grower in the Central Valley, I think more infrastructure to capture flood flows and store water in the valley is a good thing. And even though we're not served directly by the Friant unit, I would think there would be times when those waters that are captured there could be traded and swapped around to help all users within the valley. So I like the project from that standpoint. Right now, we're suffering from these intense flows that are coming down the San Joaquin River that are moving up the levees, up along the side of the levees, and we're having a lot of seepage and issues of flooding in areas where we're likely going to be losing some of our vineyards along the river. And quite frankly, I think if we had additional storage and we could better control those flood flows, it would probably be a good thing for the river, for the communities that adjoin the river, as well as anybody that has land and that's of value there. So we're supportive.
Sharon, we've heard a lot about, and agriculture is very upset about all the water that has been flowing down the river this year, down the San Joaquin River and washing out into the ocean. Is that necessarily a bad thing? In other words, is that water going into recharge? Is it being used for other purposes? All those hundreds of thousands, millions of gallons that are coming down the river right now, is that being used for other purposes?
Well, I think there are a couple of different ways to look at it. One way is to think about the fact that rivers historically, they do flood from time to time. You do have these flushing flows that go out to the ocean, and that does serve a lot of ecological purposes. It helps flush out the system. It creates new habitat that can be pollinated by native riparian species, native plants along the river's edge. And then it also helps bring fresh water into our estuary systems, which can be important for river and estuary health. But the other thing that I think isn't talked about very often is the fact that as the water is flowing down the river channel, it is actually recharging the groundwater basin underneath the river channel. And having water in the river system is a good thing for people that are utilizing groundwater near the river. Now, obviously, in our system in California, we move water all over the place. So if you're not near the river, that doesn't benefit you, but it does benefit people that are along the main river channel.
And is that
Go ahead,
Okay,
Aubrey,
I can
please.
just jump in here. I mean, and when you look at how the system was designed, I mean, a lot of our rivers used to go dry naturally during other parts of the year. So the fact that you can keep a consistent flow, which a lot of our environmental protection programs are predicated on, whether it's for water quality or species or oxygenation or whatever it may be, that's where having that additional control, because I can only imagine, to Stuart's point, kind of combining the 2 points is, and we've seen it at Oroville this year, that vast amount of water moving that fast completely changes the landscape from an ecological standpoint as well. And I think having, again, looking at how we now manage the water and we manage our environment. So when we look at these projects like Temperance Flat or sites or Raising San Luis or Shasta or whatever we're looking at, there is no way we're looking at it through the first half of the 19th century lens anymore. We're looking at it in terms of also how do we manage this if our goal is to protect or preserve species or keep flows at a certain time of year or keep water at a certain temperature while still providing a reliable and affordable water supply to all water users in California. We have to be looking at how these projects are going to allow us the flexibility to meet the goals, if that's the intention, is to actually meet those goals, kind of touching on Sarge's point too.
Mario, you want to make a point about this?
Yeah, I think I want to answer your question a little more directly, and that is that the other key element of Temperance Flat is exactly what you said, and that's flood control. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In 1997, there was 120,000 cubic feet per second inflowing into a reservoir. Okay, now those numbers may not mean a lot to the general public, but that is huge. What that meant was that was about a quarter of the entire capacity of the reservoir in one day.
You're talking about
Millerton Lake. Okay, and so what ended up happening that year is that the lake level exceeded the maximum capacity of the dam. That would have been our Oroville. Had it gone more than that, we would have seen a structural failure of that dam. Now, what was happening to try to prevent that? The Bureau of Reclamation was releasing approximately 60,000 cubic feet per second into the San Joaquin River. They had all the valves open. There was 10 foot of water flowing over the three gates above it. So a perspective here, San Joaquin River has a capacity of 8,000 cubic feet per second. You were putting 60,000 cubic feet per second. So what do you think was happening throughout that river? It was scouring everything. It was flooding everything. There was no good happening out of that. People were panicking. People in Fireball, people in Mendota, they were sandbagging. They were worried that was going to come into their homes. So this is not the kind of condition you want to have on a regular basis. So building temperance would preclude that kind of danger for those communities and the farmers that live adjacent to it. The other thing I'll note here is the program called the San Joaquin Valley Program. Okay, that program is going to stick about $2 billion worth of infrastructure in the San Joaquin River. Okay, just think about another year where you have that kind of flow. It's going to blow all that stuff out. So
what is that stuff? What's that
well,
stuff?
basically,
What are you talking about, Mario?
it's improvements in the channel. It is basically structural fish gates within the channel. Lots of things that if a big flow comes through, it's just going to blow it out. Now, I think there's probably a big question right now whether it's good money to be investing in that program. Think about if it blows it out, are you going to reinvest it again? So how does that help that particular environmental program? It does not. Okay. The other thing I want to note here is that the fact that creating additional water storage means that you have opportunities during extremely dry years not only to provide water for the cities, the farms, but it can be helpful with the program for the fishery programs, right? You want to maintain water in that river. You want to maintain cold water in the fisheries. The thing that I have argued for a long time with the environmental community is that, you know, if you want to restore a cold water fish, well, the key word is cold water. And right now, when you have a little dam, you have very little cold water because of physics. You create a bigger cup, that means you're going to have broader amount of cold water. That is going to be helpful for that kind of program if, in fact, you want to actually reestablish fish. So the idea that a dam is harmful to the environment, that's not a good argument. You know, lastly, in terms of flooding, not only do you have impact locally here with the communities, but think about it. San Joaquin River is not the only river that releases water into that tributary. You have a whole bunch of other rivers that are feeding it into it. And you know where it's going? It's going to the Delta. Now, the Delta is going to be receiving all this amount of water, and it's got about 1,100 miles of very unstable levees. If you start putting that kind of charge into that system, it's bound to blow out some levees. So the idea that somehow you don't want to control that water, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, and to that point, when you blow out those levees, you run the risk of contaminating 80% of the state's fresh water supply with saltwater inundation. Now let's look at cost-benefit analysis. $3 billion to build Temperance Flat, $2 and whatever to build another, some change to raise San Luis, some change to raise Shasta, maybe some, 1.5 to build a groundwater, bank somewhere else, versus the tens of billions of dollars to try to reconstruct levees, to rebuild towns, to clean up the water supply. And how many years would that take to try to clean up a poisoned and contaminated California aqueduct should saltwater intrusion get into that, should a levee break at that level of capacity? The reality of it is, to boil it way back up to that, take it way back up to that 30,000 foot level, we have ignored investing as a state in our water infrastructure for far too long. And we now run the risk of having to pay for our mistakes and our consequences, which are going to be 10 times or 100 times more costly than ever getting into this preemptive and proactive mentality in investing and upgrading and maintaining these infrastructures.
Sergeant Winky, you talk about, I want to bring you in this,
I'd like
please.
to add another side of it, though. One thing we continue to have to think about, though, is that a river has no master. At some point in time, something's going to happen that is catastrophic. And so good planning, in my mind, also requires the desire and the need and the opportunity to not build more infrastructure, especially communities next to rivers, or to understand that a river corridor has multiple functions. And so that if we can come to some compromise on how to manage the system in a more collective way in the future. We have to understand the entire system.
Yep.
You can't look at it as an individual section, oh, well, we got to do this here, or we have to do that here. You have to look at it in its entirety and manage it from the perspective that this is going to happen sooner or later, and we need to know what that might look like, and then figure out how to potentially avoid some of the consequences that we know are very much possible part of the process.
That holistic approach,
more holistic approach. Yeah.
Sergeant Mario mentioned building that bigger cup. If we don't have Temperance Flat, what about raising the height of Bryant Dam or expanding the size of Millerton Lake? Would that work? Is it a viable option?
Well, I would say that it's probably not a real good option. You'd have to do a little more technical work to figure out how it's anchored. There's a lot of work that goes into the calculations and the engineering and the geology to make sure that Bryant could have that thing. But what would you do if it still is not enough? I think the opportunity that we're exploring is that you have, once again, greater flexibility if you have both. So you can hold a lot of water behind Temperance Flat and then use Friant to dose it out. So I think that's part of the process that Mario was talking about that we're going through in the application process. So I think that will be one of the alternatives that we have to look at is, well, how does it compare to an enlarged Friant? And I think Mario's probably got some of the answer to that, but it's so far, all of the previous work, the feasibility study and all those things have pointed out that Temperance Flat at this time seems to be the most logical alternative.
The delta is the big issue, though. I mean, everybody, we're talking about Temperance Flat a lot, and that's great for Mario and everybody that wants the dam built, which is cool. And I think it should be built as well. But there's a lot of acreage in the San Joaquin Valley that doesn't get its water from that project. So, and most of our problems in the state have to do with the regulatory controls on the delta, and what's stuck with those two pumps that pump to the Mendota Canal and that pump into the aqueduct. And that's kind of where the battle is on this whole thing to me. We can talk about, dams being built and not, and whether temperance makes sense or not. It's hard to say we don't need storage. It's okay. It's a hard thing to argue. But when you get down, the control of Sacramento is really happening in the Delta. That's where the most damage to agriculture is being done from my perspective.
So Jeff, maybe what you're saying is there a political will in Sacramento, in Fresno, in Washington to get these projects accomplished? Or are there too many other outside interests that it will never make it happen?
The whole problem is, you brought it up, I think Aubrey brought it up, the state of California right now has 2 water projects. They were designed to give water to people, the State Water Project, and to agriculture, the Central Valley Project. And then later after that, environmentalism was born. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't protect our species. No. I don't think there's any grower in California that feels that we should just let a species die or be careless with a species. But that third user of these 2 projects that they weren't intended to use, they get to now control the water that goes to those projects. I don't think people understand that. We tried to explain that in the film because that's like the big red herring here. That's the thing.
And that becomes the second part of kind of the water crisis, right?
Yeah.
We had a drought and then we had a water crisis. And the water crisis is this lack of infrastructure, but also how it's managed. And the rules and regulations, even once all of this is built, of how this is all going to operate. And Sarge is bringing up, he keeps beating that drum about actually agreeing. How about actually having accountability and measurements of requirement? So we start getting to a position of using these projects to incentivize the successes that we're after, as opposed to keep throwing good water and good money after failed projects. I don't want to see a species die either. I don't want to see a river go away either. But the reality of it is we manage these projects now. And any future we have of that has to be put into a measurable and an accountable system so that we are using these resources efficiently and effectively to maximize their impact.
Stuart Wolf, your thoughts on what she's saying here?
I think she's dead on. I think if you were to actually use the projects for what they were built, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. So we have more water that needs to be dedicated to the environment. And as Jeff said, I think most farmers sitting back would think, well, after 20 years of managing flows to improve the ecosystem in the Delta, we would have thought that there would have been greater impact and actually been able to restore some of the water that we have lost. But again, we've been doing this for over 20 years, and it seems like the response and answer to our failure of succeeding in the Delta is maybe we should take more water. So, effectively, we've taken a huge share of the junior rights holders south of the Delta. Those water supplies are now in the Delta. I think you move up to the San Joaquin River, we're talking about more flows going to the Delta. Presently, the state's talking about going up into the Stanislaus County and what have you, and taking close to 40% of those flows there. And it seems like we are perpetually chasing the dream that flows by themselves will cure these problems, but there's no evidence that this has worked over 20 years, and at a huge cost.
Well, to kind of maybe add to what Aubrey said, and that is that today, of the 3 water users, urban, agricultural and environmental, only 2 are required to put and submit water usage efficiency plans. So if you're a farmer, you have to be able to prove to the state that you are managing, using your water in the most efficient way possible in order for you to continue to do business. If you're a city, you have to submit an urban water management plan to show that the city is using the water in the most effective way. Environment, they're not required to do that. So the point is that, you know, if you don't have to prove you're using water wisely, and all you have to do is notch it up to get more water to eventually get to your goal, that's really not a fair way of using water. So lots of us have argued that if we want to find this mutual solution, then we all have to be in the same playing field. Everybody should be required to do exactly the same. That's the only way you're going to find answers. But until that happens, and I got to tell you, I don't see the will in Sacramento to do that.
Well, Mario, I think you're leading into something that I wanted to take you all towards. And that seems to be, there seems to be these extreme perceptions on both sides. The environmentalists believe that the farmers just want all the water to themselves. There's that group. And then there's a group of farmers who perhaps believe that environmentalists just want to wipe out farming. What do you do with these 2 polar opposites when you're trying to bring people together to get us some kind of solution? Who would like to tackle that? Sarge?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'll tell you, I know it's really difficult for people like Stuart on the west side. I think one of the problems is that 20 years, I know sounds like a long time, but we're still trying to refine the science. That's a big part of the problem these days, is that we're learning as we're going in some instances. And I would like to point out one program that I feel is doing a pretty good job of trying to line it out. They completely reorganized the science in the Delta by forming a Delta Stewardship Council. And that's got people that have a lot of science behind them, and they're feeding it to basically a lay council. And that group then helps make the decisions. And they're involved in the decision even to some degree on the proposed bond funds being offered that Mario is talking about for Temperance Flat. So the science has to do a little bit more. Now, can we do a better job with the science, speed it up, get it done? I think that's probably one of the investments that we have to make as well at the same time. And I question whether or not we have made that kind of a commitment to get enough money to get the kind of results that we can all agree upon. Delta Stewardship Council has been around since 2009, and they're making some progress, but perhaps it's
what are they putting science on? What are they doing?
Well,
that's what I think people want to know. When they hear a comment like that,
yes,
it just kind of people glaze over. What are they doing? Are we studying a fish? Are we digging for snails? What are we doing? Like tangible, what are we doing?
Well, one of the things as an example, I think they didn't even know where Delta smelt were born at one time, not too long ago. And it's in the water. It's in the water. There's no question about that. But they had a place, and we didn't know the place. Yeah. And now we know the place, okay? We've got some pretty better information.
That's a good example. Okay.
A good Delta smelt information. And we know a little bit more about salmon. We know a little bit more about the food on the bottom and how some of the bad guys that have snuck into the back door have eaten it all up. And the salmon don't have much of a chance. They're starving before they get out. Now we've learned that we can fatten them up a little bit on some side areas up on the Sacramento River. So there's some science that's starting to come along. Is it fast enough? That's the question.
I think that's great, except that people like Stuart and a whole bunch of other folks, they're not going to survive waiting for that science to eventually reach some conclusion.
And what if the science says we need all that water?
Well,
that's my whole point. Is like, what if the answer isn't the thing any of the people growing food want to hear?
Well, society has to figure out what their priorities are.
Exactly.
All right? I mean, when these facilities were built, you can go to John Kennedy, whether he was speaking of San Luis Reservoir or Whiskeytown Dam, he made a clear statement. He's saying, hey, best way to use our resources is to use these waters that have normally gone to the ocean for the cities and the farms. Because you know, that's what our nation is.
The
It's
problem
people.
was those speeches were given 9 years before the
I
the
understand
Endangered
that.
Species
I understand
Act.
that. But at the end of the day, you know, I would hope that the human being has a level of priority. And right now, I think that's one of the greatest failures we have right now in existing environmental laws. It went from basically a scale that understandably might have been pro-infrastructure and was theoretically supposed to be adjusted to the middle. It has now gone here. The only way we're going to be able to make any progress is to go back and revisit some of these laws to make sure that there's some balance in how not only the environmental aspects are being looked at, but what are the social and economic impacts to human beings.
But
I would kind of just twist that just a little bit and say it's not, we have to get these laws into the 21st century. We have 21st century science, which we have caught up a lot since 1973. We have real-time data that we didn't even start using on operating the pumps until this last November when the WIN Act passed Congress. All it took was sending someone out there to go look. But that was real-time data we weren't using. So we have science and technology, 21st century science, 21st century technology, 21st century outlook, 21st century partnerships. Any company in the United States today that thinks it's going to do business by destroying the environment will die. That is not the social mentality of this country anymore. And the other part of this is we have a 20th century law with less than a 1% success rating, with no requirement for measuring its impact on the economy or on human impact, and no requirement for outlining or identifying measurable goals, and no requirement for even having to measure them. How is that protecting the environment? Let's incentivize success. Let's get the environmental laws into the 21st century and saying, if you're failing, get a new plan and we'll fund that. And if you're succeeding, we'll double your funding.
Sharon, what are your thoughts on what
go
Aubrey's
back to
saying
money.
right here with
Well,
the environmental issue?
you know, I mean, to me, we're talking about a dichotomy that I think doesn't exist, because environmental health is human health, and the two are interlinked. The environment isn't separate from us. We are part of the environment. And so, yes, you might have an issue with a specific law and how that specific law is being implemented, but protecting the environment is protecting human health and human life. So that's what I would focus on. And I think that one of the ways that, you know, I appreciate what Aubrey has kind of focused on in terms of multiple benefits and all the different technologies that are available to us today. And land conservation is just one of those technologies. Habitat enhancement is another sort of old school type of technology, but it's part of that overall puzzle to conserve water, conserve the resources that we have, because conservation is certainly part of the picture.
Well, folks, we've talked about building dams and recharging the aquifer and some deep philosophy about what's going on in this country. But maybe the folks at home right now are just watching this saying, what does this all mean to that peach I like, or that apple I like, or that cluster of grapes? You know, how do we maintain food security in this country if the water supply is in constant flux or is in jeopardy? Stuart, would you like to address that?
Well, one thing in California, maybe I differ a little bit than some of my fellow farmers in thinking this. Whenever we talk about food security, I've never walked into a grocery store in the United States anywhere and thought, man, there's not enough food in here. Okay, so, one thing about California, we are the most productive and diverse region in the world. We're in the right latitudes, we have this entrapped air basin, so we can produce a bounty like nobody else can. And consequently, we do a lot of exporting. Now, if we had to shrink the valley and we had to ruin some of these communities and what have you, I don't know that we wouldn't still be able to feed the better part of the United States and what have you. But we would lose the opportunity to feed the rest of the world. And I'm thinking, if somebody is really anxious about resource management, I can't think of a better place where you get the highest yields for the fewest drops of water on the most productive land and diverse land anywhere in the world. Why would we shrink that so these resources could be squandered someplace else?
Sarge, would you like to add to that conversation about what's going to happen with our food security? And again, I think a lot of people are really concerned about with the water, what's the cost going to be? Will Americans pay anything for a cluster of grapes?
I think that water, because it's really talking about a change in terms of scarcity. There's more competition for it. There's more competition in other parts of the world too. It's not just here we're having these kinds of problems with figuring out what we're going to do. Other parts of the world are trying to figure out how they can get as good as we are. So we are the gold standard in many places. So I think that what we have to do better is the communication piece. Yes, the public has the right to make the decision, but we don't do a very good job of all the things that we've talked about today in communicating with the public so that can make an informed decision about some of these things. Yeah, I think we should toot our horn in terms of our capacity here in the Central and San Joaquin Valley and figure out a way to continue to do as much as we possibly can. But we also have to think that there might be some limitations. So we need to get all that information in front of people so they can make an informed decision. We have a tendency to talk to ourselves too much.
That's one reason why I was glad we made this documentary, and I hope that it airs outside the San Joaquin Valley, because the people that vote for all these regulations and these laws don't live here. They live in our population centers, and they're making other decisions than we would in the valley collectively like them to make when we're talking about agriculture. And there's just a disconnect. As long as the tap turns on and the food's cheap at the store, those guys will keep, and it's what you're saying, it's the PR battle. Central Valley Ag has not done, in my opinion, after doing this for a short amount of time and meeting the people I've met, isn't doing a great job of getting its message out.
So what's it going to take to get the folks in LA, the folks in the Bay Area, the folks in Sacramento, what kind of crisis is it going to be to get them to pay attention? Stuart?
Well, they have to have skin in the game, right? So one good news about the drought was they had skin in the game. But, once we get out of the drought and we're now back in our normal lives, I think for somebody in San Francisco or in Los Angeles and they're being told, this is about food security, this is about, I don't think they have any sense of risk of that. Of losing anything. They're making a decision potentially on, do I want to take care of the environment with no connection to what happens to these communities? So if they had skin in the game and there's 40 million acre feet between the ag and the municipal use in the state, if instead of just cutting a segment of ag, actually everybody got cut a little bit and they actually felt it, they may think twice about how they vote for projects or the lack of accountability in the environmental arena in the Delta. I think they may weigh in more.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the conversation during this past hour, but we are starting to run out of time. And I'd like to pose a final question to you all. And we'll go around and we'll get your answers if we can. We'll start with Jeff Aiello, our producer and the creator behind Tapped Out. Jeff, from what you've heard here tonight, what leads you to believe that common ground can be found or achieved to reach a solution to the valley and the state's water crisis?
It's pretty simple from where I sit. It has to do with voting. That's what it is. We can sit in these kind of forums and talk to her blue in the face, but just exactly what Stuart just said is 100% right. There's a disconnect between the voting population of this state and the crisis that's being felt in the middle of it. And so we have to figure out a way to connect those dots. And I think this is a good place to start. I think this film that Valley PBS produced is a good place to start, and I hope that it's shown all up and down the state, because that's the kind of information that I hope will change someone's mind, or at least spark natural curiosity to learn more about what's happening here.
Jeff, thank you very much. Next, we'll turn to Aubrey Betancourt. Aubrey, again, from what you've heard here this evening discussed, what leads you to believe that common ground can be found or achieved to reach some kind of solution here with the water crisis?
Communication is key, and I think that it's one thing we're going to hear over and over again, and that's something at the California Water Alliance we've spent years focusing on. How do we take the story here, and you can't expect someone to care about something they don't want to care about. So how do we connect what we know as the water dogs who know this inside and out to the mom of 3 in Compton living in a high-rise, or living in an apartment building? How do we connect it to the perfect family with 2.5 kids in San Diego? and get them and find out from them. Listening, too, is a key component to communication. What about water is their concern? And connecting our message and the overall story of the value of water in our society to them personally. And that is a key component of this communication back and forth. We can't just talk at people. We have to make the connection to them so it's personal to them, so they value water themselves the way we value water ourselves.
Aubrey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sarge Green, same question to you. Again, from what you've heard discussed here this evening, what leads you to believe that common ground can be found or achieved to reach a solution to the Valley and state's water crisis?
I think we're getting a lot closer than we have been in a long time, and it's unfortunate that it took a drought to do it. Stuart mentioned this already. We now have much more of an opportunity to impart some of the information that we have developed on how to move forward in solving some of the problems that we have, for example, so that we have more comfort that whatever decisions we make to improve the situation, that all parts of the puzzle are going to be given some attention. I, for one, am still concerned, though, that in terms of the environment, that we still don't have all the right parts there. So I still have some concerns that we don't have the right institutions and the right people necessary to actually manage it to meet the goals and objectives. It's all done by the rules and the laws that we've talked about. We actually don't have people on the ground out there helping to actually do it. And one of the things that I'm very optimistic about is that farmers can do that. Farmers can help us not only grow the food, but manage the environment in the future.
Indeed. Sarge, thank you very much. We turn now to Mario Santoyo. Mario, the same question to you, sir. From what you've heard this evening, what common ground do you hear, do you know of now that we can perhaps get this whole thing solved?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I were more optimistic, okay? But I've been in the water resources field for 40 years, and I've seen the battles, I've been in the battles. I think certainly I don't disagree with the idea of communication to the ultimately the voter will have, you know, an effect. Along those same lines, though, I think until we have political will by our legislators, both in the state and the federal, there won't be a change in success. Right now, unfortunately, I see just too much polarity between our parties, and as long as that polarity exists, it's going to be tough to get to a solution. So from my perspective, we need to change the will of our state and federal legislators, and I think we also probably have to have some honest dialogue with the environmental community. We right now, unfortunately, a lot of times we're at the extremes, yelling at each other. I might have done that tonight, but you know, at some point we have to find a way of talking to each other and then compromising in terms of what our goals are going to be. And now that's a hard goal, but you know that if we're going to find success, that's going to have to happen.
Mario, thank you very much for your comments. We appreciate it. Sharon Weaver, up next to you. And again, what leads you to believe here that there is common ground that can be found or achieved to reach a solution to this water crisis in the Valley?
Well, I'm going to be the optimist of the group and say I think there already is a lot of common ground, and I'll sort of echo what I heard Sarge say, which is that farmers are the original environmentalists, and there are a lot of farmers that do a lot of good for the land and for the environment, and so I see a lot of hope there.
Sharon, thank you very much. Last but not least, let's turn to Stuart Wolf. And Stuart, your thoughts on this question about finding this common ground, achieving this common ground?
Well, I'm very hopeful because I think in the state of California, until you have a crisis, you really don't have leadership to do anything. And so I'm hopeful that we'll have another serious crisis. But I do think we will probably, as we go down the road, ultimately, without change, we will recognize and build greater awareness for kind of the social injustice of basically cutting off one portion of the state to the benefit of other portions and their ideals about what's beneficial. And I think, honestly, efforts like this at Jeff and this film, building awareness about issues like this is kind of the first step in getting there. So I'm always hopeful. I'm a farmer.
Very good. Stuart, thank you very much. I'd like to thank each and every one of our panelists now for this outstanding conversation that we have had here. Thank you to our audience who is here with us at the auditorium. And thank you at home for tuning in and watching this very important conversation regarding the water crisis in the San Joaquin Valley. I'd also like to thank Valley PBS, ABC30, and Jeff Aiello for allowing me to be part of this program. Now it's up to you. Make those decisions. Decide what you want in your world. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good night.
Farmers face an incredible challenge today. For the first time in human history, they have to morally justify what it is they do, providing food and fiber and energy for the rest of the world, for their communities and the rest of the world.
For me, I pinch myself when I get up and I go to work, and it's like every morning the tractors are starting, everybody, all these family farms are getting ready, and we're going about feeding America.
Water, you need water to have a society. And if you don't have water, you don't have a society. And we're pushing this thing. We're pushing the envelope on this thing. And what happens, and some people will go, pshaw, we'll be fine, we'll be fine. But some of those other places said probably something similar. We'll be fine, and then after the second decade of not being fine, then maybe you just leave.
Production funding for this program has been provided by the Myers Farms Family Trust, bringing awareness to the consumer of the responsible agricultural practices performed by farmers in the fertile fields of the San Joaquin Valley, preserving the world's food supply and natural habitats for the generations yet to come. We are proud to support quality educational programs like Tapped Out and Valley's Gold, only available on Valley PBS.